Little Richard was the star, the crown, the voice, and everyone on that stage was supposed to know it. But night after night, eyes kept drifting past the microphone to the quiet guitarist in the back. Jimi Hendrix didn't sing, he didn't speak, he just played, and somehow the room followed him. Little Richard noticed, and he hated it. Backstage, the order was clear. Stay in the back, boy. Don't dress loud. Don't move. Don't steal my show. Jimi nodded, said nothing. Then, one night, instead of shrinking, Jimi did the opposite. He stepped forward, turned his amplifier up, and played in a way nobody on that tour had ever heard before. And in that moment, Jimi Hendrix made it impossible to ignore him, and everything changed.
In 1964, Jimi Hendrix was nobody. Not to the world, not to the music industry, not even to most of the musicians he played alongside every night. He was a sideman, a hired gun, one of dozens of working guitarists traveling the Chitlin circuit, playing black venues across the South and Midwest where white audiences rarely ventured. The pay was low, sometimes $20 a night, sometimes less. The hours were brutal. The recognition was non-existent. But Jimi needed the work. He'd been discharged from the Army after an ankle injury ended his time as a paratrooper in the 1st Airborne. Music was the only thing he knew besides military discipline, so he took whatever gigs he could find, playing behind singers whose names appeared on marquees while his never did. The hierarchy was absolute. The star sang. The band supported. You showed up on time, played your parts exactly as written, kept your head down, collected your pay, and moved on to the next city. Jimi understood the rules. He followed them, mostly. But even then, even when he was trying to blend in, something about his playing stood out. It wasn't just technique, though his technique was formidable. It was the way he bent notes, the spaces he left between phrases, the tone he coaxed from whatever cheap amplifier the venue provided. Other guitarists played their parts. Jimi played conversations. He'd worked with several acts before joining Little Richard's band, the Isley Brothers, Sam Cooke, Curtis Knight. Each gig taught him something: professionalism, timing, how to read a room, how to support a vocalist without overwhelming them. But working for Little Richard was different. This was the big leagues. Little Richard wasn't just a star, he was an institution, the architect of rock and roll, the man who'd given the world Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, Good Golly Miss Molly. His voice could shatter glass, his stage presence could command stadiums. He'd influenced everyone from Elvis Presley to the Beatles. For Jimi, this job meant exposure, credibility, a chance to be seen by people who mattered in the music industry. If you could handle Little Richard's stage, you could handle anything. Jimi joined the tour in early 1964. He was 21 years old, quiet, disciplined, and eager to prove himself. He wore the required uniform, a matching suit that the band wore. He stood where he was told to stand. He played what he was told to play. But within weeks, something started happening that Jimi hadn't planned. Audiences began watching him. Not just musicians in the crowd who appreciated guitar work, regular audience members, people who'd come to see Little Richard scream and dance and own the stage. They'd find themselves distracted by the guitarist in the back, the one who moved differently, whose solos seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique. Little Richard noticed. Little Richard built his career on total control. Every note, every gesture, every sequin on his jacket was calculated to create an image of divine, untouchable showmanship. He wasn't just a performer, he was a force of nature, and everyone around him existed to amplify that force, not compete with it. His band members understood this. They wore matching outfits chosen by Richard. They stood in specific positions on stage. They played their parts with precision but without personality. They were the frame. Richard was the painting.
This wasn't cruelty. This was professionalism. This was how you maintained a brand in an industry that would replace you the moment your star dimmed. But Jimi was making that control difficult. It started small. The way Jimi moved when he played, slight swaying that drew the eye. The way he dressed during downtime, colorful scarves and bold patterns that suggested someone who thought about image even when he claimed not to care. The way his solos lasted a few seconds longer than they should, exploring ideas instead of just executing them. The first warning came in a dressing room in Birmingham. "Don't move so much," Little Richard said. Not angry, just firm. "This ain't about you. You're here to support the show." Jimi nodded. "Yes, sir." He tried to stand still, but when the music started, his body responded to what he was playing. He couldn't help it. The guitar wasn't separate from him. It was an extension of his body, and his body needed to move. The second warning came 2 weeks later in Memphis. "Stay behind me," Richard said. "You keep drifting forward. People need to see me, not you." Jimi nodded again, understood. He tried to stay back, but the stage was small in these clubs, and when the music swelled, Jimi's instinct was just step into it, to occupy the sound he was creating. The third warning came in Atlanta, and this time Richard's voice carried an edge. "You're distracting the audience. I see them watching you instead of me. That's not what you're paid for. You're paid to make me sound good, not to be interesting." Jimi said nothing this time, just nodded. But something shifted in that moment, because Jimi realized that Little Richard wasn't asking him to play better. He was asking him to play less, to be less, to disappear. And Jimi understood, perhaps for the first time, that he couldn't do that. He'd spent his whole life trying to disappear. Quiet kid in school, quiet soldier in the army, quiet sideman in bands where his name never appeared on the poster. He was good at being invisible. But his guitar wasn't. When Jimi played, something true came out, something he couldn't fake or hide or diminish. It was the only honest thing about him, the only part of himself he trusted completely. Little Richard was asking him to betray that. The warnings stopped after Atlanta, but the anger didn't. Richard stopped speaking to Jimi between shows. When he did speak, his voice was cold, clipped, professional in a way that communicated disappointment. The other band members felt the tension. They avoided Jimi backstage, not wanting to be associated with someone who'd fallen out of favor with the boss. Jimi was isolated, but he was also clear. He understood the cost of obedience now. If he did what Little Richard wanted, he'd keep his job. He'd keep touring, he'd keep getting paid, but he'd lose the only thing that mattered. The confrontation came on a Thursday night in Jacksonville, Florida. The venue was a mid-sized theater packed with 800 people who'd paid good money to see Little Richard. The band had arrived early for sound check. The stage was set, the lights positioned, everything ready. Little Richard called Jimi into his dressing room. Just the two of them, no witnesses. "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice calm but final. Jimi stood by the door, holding his guitar case. "You're talented," Richard continued. "I'll give you that. You can play. But you can't be on my stage anymore. Not the way you've been doing it." Jimi said nothing. "I'm giving you a choice," Richard said. "You either blend in, play your parts exactly as written, stand where I tell you, move how I tell you, dress how I tell you, or you're done. Tonight's your last show if you can't do that." The room was silent, except for the distant sound of the opening act performing in the theater. Jimi looked at Little Richard. This man had given him an opportunity. This man was a legend. This man had every right to run his show however he wanted. But Jimi also understood something else. If he agreed to Richard's terms, he wouldn't just be playing guitar. He'd be accepting a definition of himself as someone whose purpose was to make others shine, while he remained in shadow.
And once you accept that definition, it becomes permanent. "I understand," Jimi said quietly. "So we have an agreement?" Richard asked. Jimi didn't answer directly. "I'll do the show tonight." Richard studied him for a long moment, trying to read what that meant. Then he nodded. "See that you do it right." Jimi walked out of the dressing room, carrying his guitar case. He understood what was about to happen. This was his last night on this tour, maybe his last chance at this level of exposure. After tonight, he'd be back to playing small clubs for small money, with no clear path forward. But as he walked toward the stage, Jimi made a decision that would change everything. If this was his last night, he was going to play honestly. Not to upstage Little Richard, not to rebel, not to prove a point, but because the only thing worse than losing this job was losing himself. The show started normally.
Little Richard commanded the stage with his usual fire, screaming lyrics, pounding the piano, whipping the audience into ecstatic frenzy. The band supported him perfectly, tight and professional. Jimi stood in his assigned position, playing his parts as written. For the first 3 songs, everything went according to plan. Then came the moment when Richard stepped away from the piano for a guitar-heavy number. This was Jimi's section, a solo that was supposed to last exactly 16 bars before handing back to Richard's vocals. Jimi started playing, but this time something opened up inside him. The notes came from a different place, not from memory or training or obedience, from somewhere true. He bent strings in ways that made them cry. He found spaces between standard blues notes that sounded like questions without answers. His rhythm hand worked independently from his lead hand, creating the impression of 2 guitarists playing simultaneously. The audience felt it immediately. People who'd been clapping along to Little Richard suddenly went quiet, leaning forward, trying to understand what they were hearing. This wasn't just a guitar solo. This was a conversation in a language they'd never encountered before. The musicians in the band felt it too. The drummer locked into Jimi's rhythm with unusual intensity. The bassist followed Jimi's note choices instead of sticking to his written part. The whole band elevated around what Jimi was creating. 16 bars passed. Jimi kept playing. 32 bars. The audience was mesmerized. Jimi built the solo higher, layering ideas, exploring territories that shouldn't have existed in a standard R&B song. He made the guitar speak, moan, shout, whisper. He found tones that the cheap amplifier shouldn't have been able to produce. Then, finally, he resolved back to the main theme and brought the band down to let Little Richard's voice return. The audience erupted in applause, not just for Little Richard, for what they'd just witnessed. Little Richard returned to his microphone and finished the song with professional excellence, but everyone in that theater knew something had shifted. The show ended, the band took their bows, the audience screamed their approval. Backstage, nobody spoke. Little Richard went directly to his dressing room and closed the door. The other band members packed their instruments quickly, avoiding eye contact with Jimi. Jimi stood alone, wrapping his guitar cable, knowing what was coming.
20 minutes after the show ended, Little Richard emerged from his dressing room. He walked directly to Jimi. His face wasn't angry, it was resolved. "You're done," Richard said simply. Jimi nodded. "I told you what I needed. You chose not to do it, so you're done." "I understand," Jimi said. "Leave your suit with the road manager. You can keep the guitar. You'll need it." There was no shouting, no drama, just the finality of a decision made. Little Richard walked away without another word. Jimi packed his guitar into its case. He changed out of the uniform and into his own clothes. He collected 2 weeks' pay that he was owed, $60 that would have to last until he found another gig. None of the other band members said goodbye. They had their own survival to think about. Jimi walked out of the theater into the humid Jacksonville night carrying everything he owned,
One guitar, one small suitcase of clothes, $60, and no plan. He was 21 years old. He'd just been fired from the biggest opportunity he'd ever had. He had no connections in the music industry, no reputation outside of sideman work, no clear path forward. But as he walked through the empty streets looking for a bus station, Jimi felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in months, he didn't have to apologize for who he was. After Little Richard fired him, Jimi stopped trying to hide. He worked his way north, playing anywhere that would have him. Small clubs in Harlem, jam sessions in Greenwich Village, brief stints with other touring acts who needed a guitarist and couldn't afford to be choosy. But something was different now. Jimi wasn't playing to keep a job anymore. He was playing to discover what his voice sounded like when nobody told him to be quiet. His clothes got bolder, bright colors, military jackets, scarves, hats that made him impossible to miss. His stage presence intensified. He started moving more freely, letting his body respond to the music without restraint. His guitar playing evolved rapidly. Without the constraints of someone else's vision, Jimi explored techniques that other guitarists considered impossible or inappropriate. He used feedback as melody. He played with his teeth, behind his back, over his head, not as gimmicks, but as natural extensions of the sounds he heard in his mind. Musicians started talking. In late 1965, a bass player named Chas Chandler came to see him perform at a club in Greenwich Village. Chandler had played with the Animals, one of the biggest British invasion bands. He was now managing artists and looking for something new. He watched Jimi play and immediately understood he was witnessing the future of rock music. Chandler approached Jimi after the show with a proposition. "Come to London. I'll introduce you to people who will understand what you're doing. I'll help you build a band, get you in studios, put you in front of audiences who are ready for someone like you." Jimi agreed. In September 1966, Little Hendrix arrived in London with nothing but his guitar and Chandler's promise. Within weeks, he was the talk of the city's music scene. He played small clubs where the best British guitarists gathered. Eric Clapton came to watch, Jeff Beck came to watch, Pete Townsend came to watch, Jimmy Page came to watch, and every single one of them walked away shaken, forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the electric guitar. The qualities Little Richard had tried to suppress, the boldness, the innovation, the refusal to stay in the background, were now the precise qualities that made Jimi impossible to ignore.
Bob Dylan first heard Jimi Hendrix play in early 1968. By then, Jimi was already famous. The Experience had released 2 groundbreaking albums. Jimi had headlined the Monterey Pop Festival, setting his guitar on fire in front of thousands. He was no longer a sideman. He was a phenomenon. Dylan was working on new material, questioning his own direction after his motorcycle accident and brief retirement. Someone played him Jimi's version of All Along the Watchtower, a song Dylan had recorded just months earlier as a sparse acoustic meditation. Jimi had transformed it into something else entirely, electric, urgent, apocalyptic. He'd taken Dylan's mysterious lyrics and given them a sonic landscape that made the prophecy feel immediate and dangerous. Dylan listened in silence. When the song ended, he asked to hear it again, then a third time. "That's it," Dylan finally said. "That's how that song is supposed to sound." Dylan later told a journalist that Jimi had heard something in the song that Dylan himself hadn't fully understood. Jimi's version wasn't a cover, it was an interpretation that revealed layers Dylan had written but not yet recognized. He could find things inside a song, Dylan said, and vigorously develop them. He found things that other people wouldn't think of finding in there.
The same intuition that got Jimi fired from Little Richard's band, the refusal to simply execute someone else's vision, the need to explore and expand and make the music his own, was now being celebrated as genius by one of the greatest songwriters alive. Little Richard had demanded Jimi stay in the background. Dylan was saying Jimi belonged front and center. Little Richard wasn't a villain in this story. He was protecting something he'd built with decades of work. He understood how fragile stardom was, how quickly the spotlight could shift to someone younger, newer, different. His demand that Jimi stay in the background wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But Jimi couldn't stay in the background, not because he was rebellious or arrogant or desperate for attention, but because his gift was too big to hide. His voice, expressed through 6 strings and amplified electricity, needed to be heard in its full truth or not at all. Greatness can't stay in the shadows forever. When you try to suppress it, you don't eliminate it, you only delay the moment when it breaks through. Little Richard tried to contain Jimi Hendrix, but all he did was force Jimi to make a choice: obey and disappear, or risk everything and be himself. Jimi chose himself. And in doing so, he changed what rock music could sound like, what the electric guitar could express, what it meant to be an artist who refused to compromise. The firing wasn't the end of Jimi's story, it was the beginning. Because sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is also the thing that sets you free.